G'day folks, my name is Rob and welcome back for another F1 fantasy video. In today's video, we're going through my final thoughts for the Austrian Grand Prix this coming weekend. So as always, if you're new around here, you're enjoying this F1 fantasy content, as we approach the midpoint of the season, please do drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. We're going to get through this race through my installment of this episode very quickly. We'll jump straight into some of the considerations for this weekend, some of which I actually also talked about in my team selection video and my Q&A over the most recent weekend. First cab off the rank is the Mercedes versus Ferrari debate. And I think there's been a lot of talk about that in the last few weeks around whether or not one constructor is necessarily better than the other. There's probably a number of different reasons you could make for both constructors, and I do think it's probably quite nuanced, especially when we get to free practice, because we can talk about historical statistics and performance and all of that kind of good stuff. But I do think it more or less for an A-tier asset boils down to how they're looking in free practice before we make that decision. Regardless, I'll still provide a point of view on what I think, may well be a more compelling option this week. And that's simply just because of, as I know and as I've said, recent results for both teams. I'll direct us to F1 Fantasy Tools and their statistics page, Hub 50. Details are in the description below if you want 50% off your first month of the F1 Fantasy Tools premium features. And we'll go all the way down to the bottom here. Now, I put a little bit of a tweet out around this earlier in the week, so apologies if you're seeing this for the second time. But Mercedes and Ferrari have gone toe-to-toe more or less throughout every single race week this season. Now, I say that until very recently, where there has been quite a bit of a swing in results both ways. The triple header, well documented, Mercedes very much struggled there and then turned it around in Canada for a 1-3 finish. Ferrari, on the other hand, have probably had a bit more of a consistent season on balance. The only glaring gap in their recent form is the disqualification in China. And when you look at it, you can see it's only a couple of points that separate the two teams across all 10 race weekends. So I do think it is quite a, weekend by weekend decision for both assets. I think you do have to drill down into the bigger picture to really pick apart what we think is driving one's performance over the other. And I think pit stop points, I won't spend a lot of time on it because it probably has been spoken into the void by me and other content creators. But Ferrari have lent on their pit stop prowess through 2025. We can see here over the last 8 races, Ferrari have 6 weekends of 15 points for pit stop points, and only one weekend, the disqualification in China, where they were, if I recall correctly, on for either the fastest or the second fastest pit stop that weekend. Clearly a dominant metric for them to perform this season, and that's probably what's kept them relevant in F1 fantasy more often than not. They've had their weekends. Leclerc's had a couple of podiums recently, but they're yet to see that breakthrough, especially with McLaren and Red Bull. Perhaps Red Bull and Verstappen alone having more of that sustained, dominance, if we can call it that, through 10 races. So, you look at Ferrari, 11.5 points per race in the pit stops. Mercedes all the way down at 4.5. They're yet to score more than 5 on a weekend. Didn't score any in Miami, in fact. And so it's quite a telling story that this is what gives Ferrari the edge, and I do think is what keeps them, in the discussion more often than not, even if, say, for instance, Hamilton and Leclerc don't look like they're on it in free practice. To the contrary, however, the first 6 races of the season for Mercedes were quite consistent. No score, below 45, whereas Ferrari had 3 of those, but they couldn't actually, develop or deliver that explosive potential. You could see, Ferrari in Bahrain had 73 and then another 70 plus performance in Monaco. It wasn't until Canada where we saw that breakthrough from Mercedes. George winning the race. He had pole there last year, did the same again this year. And then Kimi finished on the podium as well. This was actually Mercedes' highest ever score in F1 fantasy for the last 3 years. So I do think that bodes well for them moving forward. Do I see this happening every week? No. But I do think Mercedes have the edge. They can show they've been on the podium more often. They can show they can win the race. I don't want to get too caught up in the cold weather temperatures that they do perform well in. But their last victory, surprise, surprise, came in Las Vegas, which was also cold last year, where they had a 1-2. So I think they've kind of got a higher ceiling compared to Ferrari, but obviously the pit stop points for Ferrari is what's making them more of a decision every single race weekend. So yeah, I think that's something certainly to think about for them. And Russell alone, we know how good of a driver he is. I do think that doesn't suddenly disappear. He also won in Austria last year when Max and Lando obviously couldn't complete the race, or at least Max did, but fell down the order a little bit. So I do suspect the edges with Mercedes. You give them, $4 million lower price on F1 Fantasy. I mean to say it's Ferrari at 29.1, Mercedes at 24.7. So it's what you can do with that other 4 odd million that really does make a difference for the rest of your team. So something just to think about. But for right now, the edge for me goes with Mercedes. I'm happily proven wrong in practice, but just something to consider. Talked about Alonso and Hulkenberg must buys, I think, this week, just because, as we've seen on the budget builder in previous installments on this channel, Alonso and Hulk can even DNF and they'll still go up the $0.6 million price bump. So I do think they become very compelling options. And for the fact that there isn't really a B tier constructor, if we scroll down, that's viable this weekend, I almost feel like Alonso and Hulkenberg, and even Gasly to an extent, kind of replace the B tier constructor. It feels to me that it's McLaren and one of Mercedes Ferrari this weekend, and I almost suspect this is the first weekend where we will, as a community, probably move away from these B tier constructors moving forward for the rest of the season. We're at a halfway point now. I don't think there's really going to be too many opportunities where people are going back into a V-Carb or an Aston Martin or a Haas. So I think it's, with the number of drivers set up for a possible $0.6 million rise, even Hadjar could potentially get there. I think this is probably the weekend where we see a lot of the people that have been running B tiers constructors move into the Alonsos and the Hulkenbergs to replace that budget building upside. Quickly on Max Verstappen, I think it's worth talking about his record at the Red Bull Ring. He's had an incredible, string of results there, particularly on qualifying, where he can deliver performances that few other drivers can match. He's had an impeccable string of podiums and wins as well. He's been on the podium in every race he has finished at the Red Bull Ring, despite having 2 retirements between now and 2023. And it just goes to show how dominant of a driver he is there. He was on track for the same result last year until him and Lando took each other out. And I think, given the fact poles and qualifying has been so dominant and so important for drivers this year, most drivers that have secured pole position have gone on to win the race in 2025. You have to look at Max Verstappen's record as something that I think is a very good omen for him here. 7 pole positions if we include the Styrian Grand Prix and the last 2 sprint qualifyings. Goes to show how good he is around the Red Bull Ring. So just something to keep in mind if you want to be a little bit spicy with your 2x driver option this week. I think Max is a really nice pick if Russell or Piastri are not kind of on the menu for you this race weekend. On to the asset tier ranking for the Austrian Grand Prix. Oscar Piastri back in the fold as the number 1 option. I thought Lando Norris might have stolen that crown away from him until he obviously crashed last weekend, but that's neither here nor there. I think goes without saying Oscar is a set and forget option, more or less, as I've been saying for the entire season. Russell, just because of that good result and his result here last year, Mercedes seemed to have the ascendancy, and then Max, as I've talked about, probably my next favourite pick behind those 2, even though it doesn't seem likely he will go up the Max rise, the 0.3. I still think points-wise, Max is an excellent candidate for a differential 2x option. Into the B tier, Hulkenberg, Alonso, I won't talk much more about them, but goes without saying, I think most people should have them in their team this weekend. Pierre Gasly, Gabriel Bortoleto, I like both of them, Gasly especially. The 5 points threshold needed for a max rise. Does he escape the revolving door of DNFs and disqualifications that plague him every 3 races? I hope so. I think it's a much easier track to navigate. Obviously, a couple of gravel traps around the track, but I do think Gasly is going to be a popular option, and I'm very much looking at him on my wildcard this weekend. As for the rest of the drivers on this list, I probably wouldn't be entertaining anyone beyond Carlos Sainz with serious thought. Kimi Antonelli is probably 1 week away from becoming a very popular option. So position your team, maybe think a week ahead, position your team so you could get him in if you can afford him with Piastri, McLaren and Mercedes in Silverstone. So that's my asset tier ranking. I don't think there are any real shocks to anyone, but if you've got any contrary opinions to what you see here on screen, let me know down in the comments below. Final team thoughts, and I know I'm racing through here. It's going to be a quick and a brief one this week, and just simply because, as I've talked about in previous pieces of content, the deadline stream for me won't be happening this weekend. I will be in the air, so we'll have to lock my team in close to or before the deadline, maybe an hour or two before the deadline. And I also won't have a deadline stream in Silverstone either. So just be patient with me for the next couple of weeks. I've tried to cram in a bit of content before Austria. I may only have the chance to get one video out for Silverstone just with commitments and such in the next 1 to 2 weeks. But in terms of what this weekend looks like for the inherent structure of my team, obviously it's currently on Lando Norris. I don't see any world in which he stays in my team at the deadline, unless of course, half the grid doesn't even show up to qualifying. The other candidates for me, I think, is Oscar Piastri, I talked about before. A set and forget 2X option has been one of the best value drivers in the A tier or on balance across the season this year. And then Max, I think, is a great alternative if you want to be a little bit spicy with your picks this weekend. The wildcard, we'll talk about my wildcard builds in just a second, but that's most likely on the table for me. Would be taking a -10 or possibly even a -20 this week. So I need to think about what I can do and how I can structure my team in that respect. And there's going to be no wet weather risks throughout the weekend in Spielberg. So, it's looking to be an interesting, few days ahead to obviously think about what this means for our F1 fantasy teams. So let's pop over to my team for this week, what that looks like from a team selection perspective. I know I've probably talked about this a lot, and I go into detail about every single slot in my team in my Q&A live stream that's on my YouTube channel. So please check that out, because I do think if you don't want a high-level summary of what my thoughts are right now, that Q&A video will give you a lot more context to the reasons and the discussions that I've thought about and had over the last couple of weeks or so since the last deadline. So I think in actuality, Norris has to go, no doubt about it. Liam Lawson has to go, no doubt about it. And I think Franco Colapinto, for me, most likely also has to leave the team. I do suspect the 0.2 rise, don't get me wrong. Glad he got it. He should have been on for a 0.6 last week. I just see no confidence in him right now. And I hashed that out in the last 2 streams on my channel. So if you want me to rant about someone who perhaps doesn't deserve his seat in F1 for someone else like Jack Doohan, Australian bias there a little bit, I will say. Check those videos out. And then obviously Ferrari is probably the other one at risk here for me. I also talked about Hadjar in my F1 fantasy team, but I think it's maybe one more week for him and then I'll perhaps bail out on him. So the most likely route for my team, if the deadline was right now or very shortly, the most likely route for my team would be Nico Hulkenberg in, Mercedes in, and then that leaves 13.2 to play around with. So I've got the option of, a couple of different drivers. Wouldn't be going near Yuki. Sainz for me is probably the standout candidate. The only thing I need to think about is that dilemma with Kimi Antonelli that I was addressing before, and if I decide to bring him in Silverstone, what that looks like for my team in 2 moves, because I only have 2 moves up to the wild card to make. So if I did that, then I would most likely have to perhaps make Sainz a slightly more affordable driver. For argument's sake, let's call it Gabriel Bortoleto. But I'm not really sure how the funds work and the price changes will fall after this weekend. So if I did something like that, I could, in Silverstone, potentially get to Kimi in 2 moves. How do I do that? Let's see. So it would, first of all, let's bring him in. Right now, I'm $0.2 million short. I'm hoping with Kimi going down another 0.3 and Hulk going up another 0.6, I can just about offset that. Maybe Colapinto has a stinker, or Liam Lawson. Lawson will go down 0.3 again. He can't go any further than 4.5. So there's definitely one other 4.5 driver on the table after Austria. So I could do that, and I'll have enough to afford that in 2 moves, assuming I then run Mercedes. But if I'm backing Kimi, I'm backing Mercedes. So that's one consideration for me. I don't know if I kept Hulk. I don't think I could do it in 1 move, to be honest. I'm 3 million short, even if I rolled Bortoletto this weekend and kept Hadjar. So just something to think about. I think the Antonelli route's probably not as budget building focused. So I think this is probably my initial read. Ocon versus Sainz is a bit of a toss-up. I think I just prefer Sainz at the moment in that Williams. If I went down the Ferrari path, it probably isn't going to look too different, to be honest. 11.5, there's that. I think I can just squeeze Hulkenberg in and Sainz. Yeah. So I can do pretty much the same thing, just pivoting on the constructor. And that's realistically probably the main dilemma for me this weekend. In terms of other moves, I just don't see any in the B tier that appeal to me right now. Russell, Verstappen, let's look at a Verstappen lineup just quickly for argument's sake. If you've got Norris and you don't have a wild card, you want to pivot into someone like Max, then potentially this could work. Something like this. Again, it depends on your budget. If you can't get to this, then I'd probably try Bortoletto. If you can't do that, then I'd probably be exploring Hadjar. Down to Gasly. I think Gasly's the other driver I haven't talked about. He's probably one other such driver that I think stands out to me. I can't do that though, unfortunately, with Sainz in my team and Ferrari. That would only look likely if I had the Mercedes constructor. The problem with running Gasly is it does make it a little difficult to pivot in 2 moves to Antonelli. So if, say, for instance, after Austria, I can't get to Antonelli comfortably, I would have to make... that would be Piastri. Now I'm just rambling because I haven't thought this out properly before the video. So this, again, I'm just going to keep talking. So this could be my team in Austria. Can I get to Antonelli in 2 moves? Let's see. I might just be able to squeeze it, but I think, again, it's price rise dependent. I'd need a few more things to go my way, which is why Gasly, for me, not so sure. Maybe 1 more week for him. So, yeah, that's kind of my thought process here. It would be a -10 to get to Antonelli. I'm not super keen about that. So just my thoughts there. I think it's Ferrari, Mercedes this weekend. I think it's Oscar. I think it's Kimi Antonelli next week at the earliest. And then Alonso and Hulkenberg seem like the most obvious budget building candidates that, if you're an engaged F1 fantasy manager, probably are in the must buy territory this week. So I'm going to leave it there for now, guys. A bit of a rushed video, I know, but I wanted to cover off as much team selection decisions as possible. A lot of what I've talked about has been rehashed in my Q&A as well. So check that out before the weekend if you haven't done so. I'm going to leave it there for now, guys. As I said, no deadline stream this weekend, no deadline stream in Silverstone, and maybe only 1 video next week. So I'll keep you posted on what that looks like. But in the meantime, have a great rest of your day. Good luck with your teams this weekend, and I will see you all very soon.